So in this podcast, I'm going to cover the objectives for Chapter 2, Positive Psychology. I really love this chapter. I love the whole field of positive psychology because it's just that. It's a spin on the way that we think about things and the way that we process things that is glass half full, so to speak. And so it puts a little twist on looking at health and looking at a lot of the different variables that relate to positive feelings and well-being. And so it's a good place to start, especially so with a topic like stress that has so many negative connotations. I think that this is a great place to be, and I like that it's in the beginning of the book to kind of form some of the foundation as we build upon it to studying stress further. So in the beginning of the chapter, you're going to learn a little bit about the history of positive psychology. It's actually been around for a while. It just wasn't called that. You may be familiar with people like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, who were more in the fields of existential and humanistic psychology, coming up with things like self-actualization and just really in general searching for the meaning in life. And so they've been around for a while and have set sort of the cornerstone of a lot of our counseling psychology that we know of today. But others have added to this field: Ed Diener, Sonia Lyubomirsky, who we're going to see a video of a talk that she gave, and as well as Martin Seligman, who's huge in this field, really framed the field of positive psychology. And when he was the president of the American Psychological Association, he made this a division of the APA, made it its own division. And that's where it really took off in the late 90s. And many people have followed suit in studying this as a field. So we get into the role of positive emotions and how having positive affect versus negative affect relates to one's ability to adapt to surroundings, ability to understand complex emotions like anger and anxiety, and process through those kinds of emotions. And that's really, the spin on it is we don't always feel positive things, we feel negative things. And how do you keep a positive outlook when you're feeling negative things? So we start to get into Fredrickson's broaden and build model that really explains the positive emotions and the role of positive emotions in an evolutionary perspective. So what is adaptive and what's evolutionary or has evolutionary value when we're talking about positive emotions? How will it help the species, right, to gain a better understanding and process through life experiences? So we start to get into specific action tendencies of emotion, negative emotions in particular, which brings us to fight or flight. And we're going to get a lot more into that in the next chapter, where we cover physiology and we cover the nervous system and its response to stress. But those negative emotions stand in contrast to non-specific action tendencies, which is positive affect. So, it really looks back at our ancestors and that evolutionary perspective and what they dealt with, what was helpful, what wasn't helpful, the role of negative and positive emotions. So we'll get into a lot of that. We'll talk a little bit about well-being and its relationship to happiness, and the whole field of happiness is a big carve out of positive psychology, as well as life satisfaction and psychological well-being. So there's some terms you're going to get familiar with, as well as what it means to have subjective well-being. Well-being is a subjective term because one can only define for themselves how well off they feel or are, how happy they are. No one can really dictate that for you. So it is a subjective thing, just like pain is subjective, right? We may all experience pain, even pain from similar sources, but our experience of the pain is very different. It's up to the individual, it's subjective. And it can have to do with a lot of elements, how you were raised or what you've been taught, your personality, all of those kinds of things. So this is also another chapter that follows along really well with what you're going to be reading in the other book, The Upside of Stress, in understanding just the complexities that go in, the thought processes that go into us being stressed and how we view it. And a big piece of that is just where we start off at. So we'll be trying to understand what one's happiness set point is. This idea that we all have a sort of place we start out at in terms of happiness. And we can kind of go a little up from there and a little down from there, but we kind of always gravitate back to that set point. So it's really that idea that happiness levels are fixed and that over time, over one's lifespan, they're stable. And we could try to control those, but we may not have much luck in doing that, as this self always wants to try to go back to sort of that homeostasis point or that set point. So we'll be looking at that. But that's not to say that people can't grow and people can't learn and understand what is well-being for them more so as they grow. So we'll be looking at positive growth and the roles of resiliency and thriving. People who thrive, what is unique about them, what variables stand out, what things about their personality stand out. There's a lot of connection here to personality psych. Of course, personality and social psych go hand in hand. That is what my doctorate actually is social personality psychology. The two are each their own fields, subfields of psychology, but they're so interconnected. So it's interesting to look at social explanations for why we do the things that we do, but sometimes we always end up coming back to the traits that we have that make us who we are. And so we see that happy people have certain traits about them that are different than non-happy people. So we'll be taking a look at a lot of Lubomirski's findings here. I think you're going to really enjoy the video that I have for you. She was a person that I worked very closely with in graduate school as well as an undergraduate. I worked in her lab. She's just fascinating in her approach to studying happiness cross-culturally, traveling all over the globe to find out, what makes happy people happy and what we can learn from that. So we'll be taking a look at some of the big 5 personality traits. We think of like the big 5, and if you haven't taken personality psych, you might not be familiar with those, but 5 main aspects of our personality would be neuroticism, extroversion, openness, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. And those are kind of like everything stems from those 5. You fall into some spectrum on each of those. And so some of those lend themselves really well to understanding happiness, and some of them don't show any links or anything there. But that will take us into looking at, life satisfaction and the role that life circumstances play in determining one's happiness. What role does income play and marital status? We'll look at bottom-up versus top-down theories of happiness, which is basically like, where does your happiness stem from? How do we view it? How do we research it? How do we assess it and measure it? So that'll be provided good groundwork there. And then we'll take a look at the kind of the flip side, which is optimism. Talk a little bit about optimism and how it relates to a person's explanatory style. We sort of have these ways of explaining how life happens. We could be pessimistic or optimistic. And people tend to kind of pick a style and stick with it. They don't flop all over the place. If you're pessimistic in one area of your life, you're not usually optimistic in another. So it kind of goes across the board, which is interesting. And it plays an important role in learned helplessness. When we're pessimistic, we may fall into the trap of feeling like life just happens to us and that we don't have much control or say in the process. And that is when we can see things like depression really set in, because we feel helpless, like we don't have any control over things, and we give up, so to speak. So we'll be looking at a little bit of that. We'll also take a look at flow. That's a new concept for many people, and its relation to goal pursuit and hope theory. Flow is one of these ideas of kind of where you get at in life, where you're just kind of in the zone. I guess that's what people say more of is I'm in the zone. Don't bother me. I'm being creative, or I'm on a roll. And so flow is this idea that you're just so immersed in an activity that you lose awareness of everything else going on around you. And this can be good, because if your circumstances are negative and bad, having a place to escape that is positive and where you get into that flow can really allow your body, your sympathetic nervous system in particular, a chance to unwind and relax and do the job of repairing of all the things that happen in your body negatively when you're under stress. So whether it's rock climbing, or whether it's knitting, or whether it's going for a run or taking a hike in a beautiful place, those are all things where it brings us out of a negative maybe environment or circumstance, and it gives you breathing room, really, is how I look at it. So this then brings up the topic, which is kind of heard of a lot today, which is mindfulness. Everyone's throwing that word around. Mindfulness, we'll look a little bit at the history of it, but just being in the present moment, how that can be helpful for us health-wise and happiness-wise. And it also plays a really important role in coping with pain, coping with loss, grief, trauma, relationship damage, all of those things, just mindfulness and how that can really help people to be more attentive and aware to what's taking place, rather than just a passive bystander in the process, again, feeling hopeless or helpless. We'll translate that onto the areas of love and relationships and well-being, and talk a little bit about concepts like compassion and empathy and altruism. And of course, these have been around forever. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow were talking about empathy and altruism as key components of self-actualization and really understanding oneself and being the self-actualized person, getting to the place where you're beyond just basic needs, and you're now trying to attain higher order needs, and it takes these elements to get there. And I have a little video that I posted about empathy, which is really good, so I hope you view that. And then lastly, just meaning and purposeful living. What is that? And its connections actually to religion and spirituality, and how that's even further connected to well-being and health. So some really interesting, great research there. And that wraps up the chapter.